So what happens when the person who has hurt you, who has been pursuing you and seeking your destruction, is finally gone? What do? Do you celebrate? Do you stay silent? Are you going to grieve? I think most of us think that our character is actually tested when our enemies are alive. But often, and this is something that's going to be very critical in 2 Samuel chapter 1, it's tested more by how we speak about them after they are gone. And in 2 Samuel chapter 1, we actually hear David, right? We see David hearing of Saul's death, and he executes the Amalekite who claims to have killed the Lord's anointed, and then composes one of the greatest songs, like grief songs in history. And we're going to discover why. Why does David mourn instead of rejoice? And why does he refuse to rewrite Saul's life into a story, right, which details how awful he was? Instead, he points, and this story is going to point towards the greatest son of David who teaches us to love even our enemies. And we're going to figure out all of this in this episode of Biblical Unlocks. This show is designed to help build your habit of reading the Bible, understanding the Bible, and applying it in your daily life. If you enjoy episodes like this, please consider following and rating the show. It's free, it helps me out a lot, and you can always change your mind later. Now let's get a little bit of context into the chapter. So 2 Samuel chapter 1 opens immediately after 1 Samuel 31, that we just saw that David has just returned to Ziklag after defeating the Amalekites, and an Amalekite messenger arrives with torn clothes and dust on his head, and he reports that Saul has died. And the messenger actually claims that he personally was the one that killed Saul at the king's request, and presents Saul's crown and bracelet, expecting, right, he expects that he's going to be rewarded by David. Instead, David mourns for both Saul and Jonathan. He orders the execution of the Amalekite for having claimed to have killed the Lord's anointed, and composes the Song of the Bow, which is a lament celebrating the courage of Saul and Jonathan while grieving the loss that all of Israel is facing. So this chapter actually shows us something very deep. Saul's reign has ended, but David actually refuses to seize the throne in this particular instance. In fact, before he becomes king, he mourns the person who is dead. So let's read the first 10 verses. The focus here is going to be on the Amalekite who reports Saul's death. My question to you is, why does the messenger think that David will reward him? Verse 1. After the death of Saul, when David had returned from defeating the Amalekites, David remained 2 days in Ziklag. On the third day, a man came from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and dirt on his head. When he came to David, he fell to the ground and did obeisance. David said to him, "Where have you come from?" He said to him, "I have escaped from the camp of Israel." David said to him, "How did things go? Tell me." He answered, "The army fled from the battle, but also many of the army fell and died. And Saul and his son, Jonathan, also died." Then David asked the young man who was reporting to him, "How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan died?" The young man reporting to him said, "I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, and there was Saul leaning on his spear, while the chariots and the horsemen drew closer to him. When he looked behind him, he saw me and called to me. I answered, 'Here, sir.' And he said to me, 'Who are you?' I answered him, 'I'm an Amalekite.' He said to me, 'Come, stand over me and kill me, for convulsions have seized me, and yet my life still lingers.' So I stood over him and killed him, for I knew that he could not live after he had fallen. I took the crown that was on his head and the armlet that was on his arm, and I have brought them here to my Lord." Now, if we were paying attention in 1 Samuel chapter 31, we actually notice that this account is different from the one that was in the previous chapter. Because in the previous chapter, we saw that Saul dies by falling on his own sword after his armor-bearer refuses to kill him. So, most people who interpret this passage actually understand the Amalekite story to be either fabricated, so a complete lie, or embellished. What's more likely is that he found Saul already dead, or he was already mortally wounded, and then he took the royal insignia. But my question to you is, why does he even invent the story? I think he assumes that David is going to reward him, right? He assumes David thinks the way the worldly king thinks. However, David, even though David's greatest enemy is dead, And he thinks, oh, surely he's going to reward me because I killed his greatest enemy. He's completely misunderstood David's heart, because David's deepest desire was never the throne, right? It was never to be king of Israel. His deepest desire was faithfulness to God. Okay? So, it's important because we see that the messenger as well is an Amalekite. Okay? And the Amalekites have been very profound in Saul's story. And at the end of Saul's life, it is an Amalekite who appears again, right? Saul actually lost his kingdom, if we remember, in 1 Samuel chapter 15. He lost his kingdom because he failed to obey God's command regarding Amalek. That's why he lost his kingdom. So, the very enemy that Saul failed to deal with now stands at the center of his downfall. Okay? So, what's interesting is the passions that we refuse, the sins that we refuse to kill, return with greater strength. And we see Saul's crown and bracelet are brought back because in the ancient world, right, these symbols of royal insignia, they represented authority. And the Amalekite actually assumes that he's presenting David with the kingdom himself. But David, he doesn't immediately place the crown on his own head. He first tears his clothes. That's astonishing, first and foremost. Tearing his clothes is a response in lamentation, right? And then he refuses to receive God's promises through this way. He knows the kingdom come, right? The kingdom will come, but it must be through God's particular pathway. Okay, let's read verses 11 to 16. The focus is going to be David mourning and he's going to judge the Amalekite here. Verse 11, Then David took hold of his clothes and tore them, and all the men who were with him did the same. They mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and for his son Jonathan, and for the army of the Lord and for the house of Israel, because they had been struck down by the sword. David said to the young man who had reported him, Where do you come from? He answered, I am the son of a resident alien, an Amalekite. David said to him, Were you not afraid to lift your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? Then David called one of the young men and said, Come here and strike him down. So he struck him down and he died. David said to him, Your blood be on your head, for your own mouth has testified against you, saying, I have killed the Lord's anointed. Okay, so what do we see here? First and foremost, David mourns for Saul. If we're thinking about it from a human perspective, surely he would be happy. You know, the person who's been trying to kill him all this while is now dead. Saul hunted David for years. He threw spears at him. He drove him into exile. He slaughtered all the priests of Nob because of him. He forced David to live as a fugitive, and yet David is sad and upset. He weeps because David never viewed Saul as his enemy. He viewed Saul as, and first and foremost, as God's anointed king, the Lord's anointed one, right? And David distinguishes, again, between Saul's personal sins and the office that God had entrusted to him. So he doesn't only grieve for Saul, but also for Jonathan, the army, and the suffering of Israel. What's more is David executes the Amalekite, right? David twice refused to kill Saul because Saul was the Lord's anointed. And whether the Amalekite actually killed Saul or falsely claimed to have done so, he confessed to the act, and David considers it unthinkable. And David judges him on his own testimony that he said, Your blood be on your head, for your own mouth has testified against you, right? He is showing reverence for God's authority. And David will not build his kingdom on violence against God's appointed king, right? So this is the most important thing that we're viewing in this chapter. David then fasts, right? Because fasting is basically expressing something. It's expressing that grief. It's expressing his mourning. And David gives grief its proper time. It's interesting. The Bible never says you should not have any grief. You should never be sad or anything like that. It says there is a time for weeping. There is a time for grief. There is a time for sorrow. So biblical faith, it never denies pain, because pain is a deep part of the human experience. Okay, let's read the final 10 verses 17 to 27. This is going to be the song of the bow, David's lament. Very important part of the chapter. Let's read. Verse 17. David intoned this lamentation over Saul and his son Jonathan. He ordered that the song of the bow be taught to the people of Judah. It is written in the book of Jashar. He said, Your glory, O Israel, lies slain upon your high places. How the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath, proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon, or the daughters of the Philistines will rejoice. The daughters of the uncircumcised will exult. You mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew or rain upon you, nor bounteous fields. For there the shield of the mighty was defiled, the shield of Saul, anointed with oil no more. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back, nor the sword of Saul return empty. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely, in life and in death, they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. O daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you with crimson in luxury, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. How the mighty have fallen in the midst of the battle. Jonathan lies slain upon your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Greatly beloved were you to me. Your love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. How the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war perished. So what do we see with this song, right? The greatest surprise of this song is that David laments. He is so sad, and he says, you know what, I want this memory to be taught to all of Israel, and Israel must not remember Saul only for his failures. He teaches them to remember him with honor, right? And what does he choose to remember? Saul's courage, Saul's military victories, his generosity towards Israel, his beauty as king. These are the things that David remembers. What does he not do? He does not erase Saul's failures, because scripture has already recorded them. But he refuses to make failure Saul's identity. Love tells the truth, but also knows when every truth should be spoken. And in this case, it doesn't need to be. And he gives special attention to Jonathan as well. He says, your love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women, right? So it's not a romantic statement, I must add. It is saying something, celebrating covenant loyalty. He protected David so much, and he loved God's covenant and purposes more than his own advancement, and he died because of it. And what's interesting here is that the friendship between David and Jonathan is one of the highest pictures of self-giving loyalty that you'll see in the entire Bible. But why do we see, right at the end, how the mighty have fallen? What does it mean? It means that, and notice this refrain here, it repeats 3 times throughout the song. The mighty have fallen, but the kingdom of God has not. Saul dies, Jonathan is dead, the armies have fallen, but God's covenant continues. Human greatness will eventually fade, but the lament that we're seeing here mourns what has been lost while still trusting the one who cannot fall. That is the deepest message here. Let's see how this chapter fulfills Jesus Christ. What's interesting in this particular chapter is that David mourns the man who persecuted him. But Jesus, he goes even further, right? Because he not only mourns for his enemies, he dies for his enemies. We remember, right? As the soldiers nail Jesus to the cross, what does he pray? He says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Luke chapter 23, verse 34. David refused to rejoice over Saul's death because he sees God's image even in a fallen king, and Christ reveals the fullness of that love by bearing the judgment his enemies deserved so that they might receive mercy instead. The lament that David has, it points towards someone greater, who transforms mourning into redemption. And where David can only sing for the dead, Jesus Christ raises the dead. And where David honored a fallen king, Jesus is the King of Kings, the righteous King, who lays down his life for his people and rises again. This is why we read in Romans chapter 12, verse 21, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. David shows us a glimpse of this principle, but Jesus perfects it and fulfills it in its ultimate sense. Be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good. Now, how can we apply this chapter in our everyday life? Is there going to be a king who tries to kill us relentlessly? I don't know, but it can be, perhaps not, but there are going to be other ways where this takes place. I think the most important thing to recognize is that you should speak about people who are not in your presence with the same grace you would want shown to you, right? We know the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But I think more importantly, when someone is not there, I want you to show the same level of grace you would want shown to you. You shouldn't compromise your beliefs. You shouldn't lie about anyone, but you need to make sure that if you talk about someone, you talk about them in a way that is grace-filled, that you speak to them as if they were right next to you, and that you give them respect and the respect that is due to them. I think that's really important. Alright, so we learned in 2 Samuel that the Amalekite misunderstands David's heart. He assumes ambition where there is obedience, and David refuses to gain the kingdom through unrighteous means. He mourns Saul because God's anointed deserves honor even after death, and David's integrity is revealed by how he treats his enemy who wanted him dead, and yet he laments over him. He mourns over him, but he also mourns for Jonathan, right? And their covenant friendship foreshadows the self-giving love that finds its ultimate fulfillment in Jesus Christ, because this chapter fulfills Jesus Christ because he loved his enemies even unto death. So Saul, even though he was an enemy of David, David loves him even unto death. Alright, so that's it for this episode of Biblical Unlocks. Next time we're going to move to 2 Samuel chapter 2, where David finally asks the question which he has waited so many years: shall I go up? Right? We'll explore why the future king begins his reign not by taking power, but again by seeking God's direction, and how his patience is going to be rewarded when God says yes. You don't want to miss it. So that's it for this episode of Biblical Unlocks. If you enjoyed this episode, please feel free to rate the show and follow. It's free, it helps me out a lot, and you can always change your mind later. Otherwise, just have a blessed day. And remember, if you're not in your word, you're in your feelings. Godspeed.